Welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. In our last meeting, we talked about various aspects of the assessment, analysis of arguments, using arguments as ways of justifying a general point of view on a question concerning a proposition. And today I want to apply that methodology to our first major topic of this course, namely theism, or the existence of a greatest conceivable being. So today we'll be getting our feet wet in the first major topic of our Introduction to Philosophy course. And to start out with that, I want you to think of the idea of God. And as such, for our purposes, God is going to be defined as the greatest conceivable being. We'll shorten that to just GCB, where a GCB is a being that has all possible perfections. If you think that omnipotence is a perfection, then the GCB has it. If you think that omniscience is a perfection, the GCB has it, and so on. For any perfection that a creature could have, that an entity could have, the GCP has that perfection as well. Now, that being so defined will only correspond imperfectly to deities that are posited by various of the famous world religions. So is there anything in the Hindu tradition, or the Zoroastrian tradition, or the animist traditions of various North American Native Americans, for instance, that correspond to a GCB? Well, to some extent, yes, and to some extent, no. I'll be talking about the GCB as an abstraction from lots of different religious traditions, focusing on that one particular general idea, and then you can think about how to apply it to those cases that interest you mostly, see how well that applies to the things that are of concern to you. So let's just review very briefly. We talked last time about what kinds of things justify a belief. And we distinguished among theoretical justifications that give evidence for the truth of a certain proposition, pragmatic justifications that try to show that belief in a certain proposition is in one's best interest, and moral justifications that try to show that belief in a certain proposition is somehow morally obligatory. We also talked about how arguments are sets of propositions that start out with a series of premises trying to establish the truth of a conclusion. We talked about how to assess an argument in terms of both validity and soundness, and we talked about various ways in which arguments can fail because of committing one or another kind of fallacy. Now we're ready to apply some of that technology to the assessment of arguments concerning the existence of a greatest conceivable being. Among the most famous arguments using theoretical rationality for theism, where theism is just the belief that a greatest conceivable being exists. Atheism, of course, is the belief that a greatest conceivable being does not exist, and agnosticism is the view that one is just going to refrain from a commitment one way or the other as to the existence of a greatest conceivable being. By way of theistic arguments, some of the most famous are the argument from design, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, and on some readings of certain philosophers, you might also feel that there is an argument from morality that tries to show that the existence of morality somehow proves the existence of a greatest conceivable being. So let's take a first jump into this topic when we talk about the argument from design. The essential idea of the argument from design is the following: that if you look around, you're going to find a great deal of complexity and apparent designedness in the organic world around you, and that complexity and apparent designedness seems to call out for an explanation. So a little bit more precisely, the idea is that the only possible explanation of the complexity and apparent designedness in nature is that the natural world was designed by an intelligent, sentient designer. I try to put that fairly carefully in order to highlight a couple of ideas. First of all, that we're talking about the natural world being designed by an intelligent designer, not just sheer luck, for example. And secondly, the idea is that the natural world has to be explained as something that was created by a sentient designer, a creature, an entity that has some kind of awareness or consciousness or consciously formulated plans, thoughts about the future, things of that kind. That's what I mean by an intelligent, sentient designer. And it doesn't take very long to think about how a person might be very impressed by the organic world around her or him to see that there must be an explanation for this. Think about the beauty and apparent complexity in organic phenomena such as plant life or animal life. Think about how complexly beautiful the peacock's tail is. Seems like it wouldn't have just happened by chance. Seems like it calls out for an explanation. Or the human eye, incredibly complex and sophisticated as an organ for the production of vision, seems like it calls out for an explanation of how things could have become that way. Now, a philosopher, theologian named William Paley, whose dates were 1743 to 1805, famously developed the analogy of the watch, in which he argued that if there was a watch that you came upon under certain circumstances, you'd be finding yourself thinking that it requires an explanation as well, and then he draws from that the conclusion that, by analogy, something similar must be the case with the organic world around us. So Paley was, as I mentioned, an English theologian. He was also a philosopher. He was a supporter of the American colonies during the Revolution. Unlike many of his English brethren, he was a proponent of what we now call natural philosophy, which is the idea that we should try to support the idea of the existence of a greatest conceivable being by means of reasoning as opposed to just an act of faith. And he writes in a very short essay that discusses this topic, when we come to inspect the watch, suppose you were walking in the country, he says, and you come across something that hits your shoe, you look down to see what it was, and it turns out to be a watch. And you pick it up and you examine it, and you find that it's got a seeming amount of complexity. It seems to work on its own and so forth. And he says, when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in, for example, a stone right next to it, that the several parts are put together, framed for what seems like a certain purpose, namely keeping time. Now, even if you had never seen a watch at all before, or a watch like this before, you might still, as long as you have a concept of a timekeeper, be able to discern that this is a thing that does in fact keep time. And it seems like it would be very implausible that it would have just come into being that way by chance, by luck, and so you'll say there must have been some intelligent creature that designed it to do the job that it does. So here's an example of a watch, of an image of the sort that you might come across. Now, he also points out that the conclusion that we draw from the watch case does not require that we ever have seen a watch made. You might not know how watches are made. And furthermore, even if there are a couple parts within the watch that you didn't know, where you didn't know how they operated or what they did, you might still find yourself still very impressed with the overall function of the watch. And notice that you wouldn't be satisfied if somebody said, well, something had to be there, so why couldn't it just as well have been a watch like this? To which one wants to answer, well, there are lots of much more plausible alternative things that could have been there. A stone, some leaves, where we don't call for any special explanation for why they're there. Something this complex and sophisticated, however, does seem to cry out for some special explanation. So Paley goes on and discusses various aspects of the example of the watch, and he continues, writing, this mechanism being observed, the inference, we think, is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who completely comprehended its construction and designed its use. Paley's idea is that the conclusion is irresistible, that there must have been an intelligent, sentient designer who designed and built this watch, maybe even who put it here, and that's what's necessary to explain the phenomenon before us. Paley even goes on beyond this and says, well, suppose you were to discover something even more exciting about this watch, namely that it had the capacity within itself to produce little new watches from inside. So after you spent some time with the watch, you found little, so to speak, baby watches coming out of it after a while. You'd surely be even that much more impressed with the thing than you had been before. You'd even be that much more likely to admire the contriver of this contrivance. Now, obviously, the question is, if Paley's drawing an analogy here, he's surely drawing an analogy with biological organisms, plants, animals, and so on, that seem to not only be able to perform complex tasks, but also have the capacity for reproduction. So think about things like the mitochondrion within human cells and the cells of many other animals. These are little powerhouses that store and produce energy for other parts of the cell, and they are incredibly sophisticated and complicated, incredibly effective at doing what they do. Everybody should be grateful for the mitochondria inside them and the other creatures around them. And it seems like if you were to come across a mitochondrion under your microscope, you wouldn't say, oh, well, something had to be there. Why couldn't it have just as well have been this? You'd want to say, well, what explains the fact that this has the features that it does? It seems like it's got a great deal of complexity and apparent designedness that seem to call out for explanation. To say nothing of something as incredibly sophisticated and complicated as the human brain. Okay? So Paley seems like he's trying to suggest an analogy between the fecund watch on the one hand and living organisms on the other. And he concludes by writing the following. There cannot be design without a designer, contrivance without a contriver, arrangement, disposition of parts, subserviency of means to an end. These all imply the presence of intelligence and mind. Thus, Paley, writing in the middle of the 18th century, concludes by, insofar as we just look around us, take note of the complexity and seeming designedness of natural phenomena around us, concludes that we have to, if we're going to account for these things, have to posit an intelligent, sentient designer in order to account for these things. And he says that being, that intelligent, sentient designer, must itself be a GCB. Now, as we'll often be doing in this course, we're going to try to take a line of reasoning that we find in a natural language like English, and then try to crystallize it, isolate it, put it under a microscope, so to speak, to see whether it holds up under scrutiny, the scrutiny that we've learned to apply in the context of assessing arguments. So if we were to take Paley's line of reasoning and translate it into the form of a fairly explicit argument, it might go as follows. Premise 1. We observe a great deal of complexity and apparent design in the organic world. Premise 2. The only possible explanation of this complexity and apparent design is that it's due to the work of an intelligent, sentient designer. Therefore, Paley concludes, there must exist an intelligent, sentient designer responsible for the complexity and apparent design in the organic world. Now, we've got an argument here laid out that's supposed to support the conclusion, line number 3, and now our question is, how good is this argument? And that breaks down into the question, is the argument sound? Which itself breaks down into the question, is the argument valid, and does it have true premises? Well, might one challenge one of the premises of this argument, for example? Let's leave aside the question of validity for now. Are all the premises true? As many of you know, one of the most earth-shaking scientific developments of the latter half of the 19th century was the theory of evolution by natural selection, famously associated with Charles Darwin. Darwin and his followers proposed that the apparent complexity and designedness in the organic world is due to something other than the work of an intelligent, sentient designer. So Paley's argument has as its second premise the claim that the only possible explanation of the complexity and apparent design is that it's due to the work of an intelligent and sentient designer, whereas the theory of evolution by natural selection says, well, hang on, maybe there's another possible explanation of the complexity and apparent design in the organic world, namely that it's due to something that is not a sentient designer, maybe also not intelligent. We can leave aside the question whether natural selection is an intelligent process. It certainly is not a sentient process. So natural selection, the theory of evolution by natural selection, is a pretty austere theory. In its simplest form, it just has the following hypotheses. It assumes genetic inheritance, that the offspring of a parent has roughly significantly correlated genetic material with that of its parent together with any other parents that helped produce it. There are random changes in the genome from one generation to the next, and there are differential survival or reproduction abilities based on these random changes. That's all, nothing else. That's all there is to the core theory of evolution by natural selection. There have been modifications and further revisions of the theory over the last century, but these are the basic ideas of evolution by natural selection. And the idea is, the important thing for you to understand is the following. Evolution by natural selection may itself be an intelligent designer. We can leave that question aside, whether or not you think evolution is an intelligent process. But it's not a sentient process. It does not require any plans or intentions, any foresight, or any thoughts. So evolution by natural selection, or ENS, offers an alternative explanation of the phenomena that Paley cites. It just therefore shows that Paley is mistaken to hold that the only possible explanation of the organic complexity and apparent designedness is that of an intelligent, sentient designer. ENS says, here's another possible explanation, namely perhaps intelligent but certainly not a sentient designer, that is, evolutionary processes. Now, Paley might retort, might reply with the following. He might say, look, evolution by natural selection is just a theory. It's not yet proven by the evidence available from the fossil record. There are lots of Many people know that there are lots of biological phenomena for which biologists don't have a complete evolutionary explanation. Take, for example, human natural language. We don't yet know how human natural language evolved. And so there are ways in which evolution by natural selection is not explained all that it purports to explain. But I would reply to Paley if I were to have a conversation with him and he were to say this. I would say that reply misses the point. And that's for two reasons. First of all, just because something's a theory does not mean it can't also be true. We've got plenty of theories, quantum mechanics, plate tectonics. They're theories, all right. They also are supported by an incredible amount of evidence. Firstly. Secondly, we'd only need to agree that evolution by natural selection is a possible account of the apparent complexity in design, as opposed to one that's, and therefore one that's not yet ruled out by our evidence so far. So there are plenty of theories from the history of science that have been ruled out as things we definitely know are not correct accounts of things. That would not be a possible challenge to Paley's explanation. But evolution by natural selection, even though it has not been completely and fully substantiated, has not been ruled out either as a non-starter type of theory in the way that many other scientific theories have been, and therefore it still, in our book, should count as another possible explanation of the complexity and apparent design in natural phenomena. Okay? So evolution by natural selection has a direct, right down the middle, so to speak, kind of challenge to Paley's argument. It says, even though it's true that positing a GCB is one possible explanation, evolution by natural selection is another possible explanation of the complexity and apparent design in the natural world around us. Therefore, if your argument for theism, for a theistic conclusion, is one that asserts as one of its premises that the only possible explanation of complexity and apparent design in the natural world is the work of a GCB, then that is just something that we can challenge. We can deny that premise and therefore claim that the argument is not sound because not all of its premises are true, firstly. Secondly, notice that even if Paley's argument were sound, it would show at most that there is an intelligent, sentient designer responsible for the creation of the world. It would show nothing about the moral attributes of that entity. So here's an image of Kronos devouring one of his children. Kronos, according to Greek mythology, is said to have created the universe, and was also the beginning of time, but was not particularly nice or pleasant. He went so far as to cannibalize his own offspring. Now, maybe Kronos was intelligent and sentient in such a way as to be able to create the complexity and designedness of the natural organic world around us. But that doesn't make him particularly worthy of a theist's worship. He doesn't have particularly good moral attributes. And therefore, even if you are Paley, you're not going to be able to prove, by means of the analogy of the watch, you're not going to be able to prove that a GCB exists. The most you'll be able to prove is that there's an intelligent, sentient designer. So that creature might not be benevolent, might not even be omnipotent, might not even be very smart. And so one wonders whether or not that creature should be worthy of anybody's worship. Up until the middle of the 19th century, my understanding is that one of the most powerful supports for justifications for theism was precisely the Paley-style reasoning, the reasoning that suggested that the only possible explanation of the complexity and apparent designedness in the organic world was the work of an intelligent, sentient designer. And one of the reasons I suspect that Darwin's theory, the theory of evolution through natural selection, was so shocking and earth-shaking as scientific theories go, was in part because it did challenge many of the justifications people had for their theism. But now, many people nowadays are going to be happy to accept one or another form of evolution through natural selection and look for another kind of basis, another kind of not just basis but also justification for their theism. So many people will say, look, perhaps we can give an evolutionary explanation of biological phenomena, of the eye, of the brain, of skin, and of flowers and peacock's tails and so forth. That's all fine. But you still haven't explained what needs to be explained, namely that there's stuff in the universe at all. So here's an image from the Hubble Space Telescope of the famous Horsehead Nebula. That's a picture of something that you might say has a kind of apparent designedness about it. It kind of looks like a horse's head, but you might also say perhaps that's just kind of a chance phenomenon, and we shouldn't be too impressed with that. And yet still, the fact that there are nebulae at all, and stars, and gravitational constant and things of that kind suggest that, well, there's something as opposed to nothing at all. Does that not call out for an explanation? The very fact there's anything at all, you might say, requires some kind of basis, some kind of account. And now we move on to what's known as the cosmological argument, which precisely tries to show that the very fact that there is some kind of entities in existence itself is enough to prove the existence of a greatest conceivable being. So the essential idea of the cosmological argument now is the only possible explanation of the very fact that something exists at all. Forget about whether it's organic or not. The only possible explanation of the very fact that something exists at all is the action of a greatest conceivable being, or if not that, then at least something very G, that is very great. This line of reasoning is most famously associated with St. Thomas Aquinas, whose dates were 1225 to 1274. He's usually just called Thomas by those who follow him, and those who follow him are often called Thomists. He's thought by many to have been the Catholic Church's greatest theologian. That's saying a lot. And he's also a leading figure in a tradition known as natural law. Many jurists, legal scholars, ethicists, political philosophers are very influenced by the tradition going back to Thomas Aquinas in thinking about the role of government, the role of individuals in society, and so on. Many later philosophers, much later philosophy defined itself in reaction to one or another aspect of Thomism. And he's famous for what's now known as the 5 ways. He held that there are 5 different ways of proving the existence of a GCB. One such way he formulates as follows. Whatever is moved must be moved by something else, by another. If that by which it is moved be itself moved, then this also must be moved by another thing, and that by another thing, and so on. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only in as much as they are moved by the first mover. So Aquinas is assuming that there can be no first mover, and on that assumption, there has to be a first mover, and on that assumption, he's assuming that that's what's necessary to explain all the other things that happen. And by mover, he means essentially any event. Anything that occurs, the dropping of a baseball, the blowing of a little bit of wind, the eruption of a volcano, doesn't matter. Any event that happens in the physical world counts as a series, an element of the series of events or causes in a chain of motions. We can formulate this, as you might expect, in terms of an argument. Let's try it. Premise number 1, everything has a cause. Premise number 2, a chain of causes cannot reach back infinitely, for otherwise there could be no way in which any of the causes could come into being in the first place. Therefore, he concludes, there must be a first mover, and I'm now quoting him, and this everyone understands to be God, what we'll interpret it as a GCB. That's Aquinas' line of reasoning, put in terms of premises and a conclusion. Let's move next to see whether that line of reasoning is cogent. So now we're ready to take a look at that argument, assess it, see whether it's a persuasive one. And that's, of course, going to be the question whether the argument's sound, which itself includes the question whether the premises are all true and whether the argument is also valid. Well, our first question, which you should know to ask based on what we talked about in the context of the cosmological argument, our first question is, even if Aquinas can prove there must be a first mover, must that first mover be a greatest conceivable being? Maybe that first mover is not particularly nice or smart. So that's one question we want to have on the table. Another question is it really true that there cannot be an infinite series of causes? After all, we know what it is for there to be an infinite series of numbers. The integers, for example, is a set of numbers such that for every number n, there's one you get by adding the number 1 to it, n plus 1, and you can go on like that forever. So it seems to me that the idea of an infinite series of numbers is a coherent one, no contradiction. Why, therefore, can't there be an infinite series of events, which you might call an infinite causal regression? An infinite series in which each event has a cause, which itself has a cause, which itself has a cause, which itself has a cause, and so on infinitely. Where's the contradiction in that idea? Where's the incoherence in the idea of an infinite series of causes? Aquinas does not give us an answer to that question so far as I know. Because we have the idea of an infinite series, why can't we also form the idea of an infinite series of causes? So let's go back to Aquinas' argument. The first premise was everything has a cause. Let's give him that for now. We'll come back later in this course to consider whether it's really true that everything has a cause. Let's just assume that for now. Premise 2, a chain of causes cannot stretch back infinitely, for otherwise there could be no way in which any of the causes could come into being. That's one that we might want to try to challenge. We're not sure at this point whether it's true that a chain of causes cannot stretch back infinitely. Maybe you could have an infinite causal regression. If there is an incoherence in that idea, if there's some kind of hidden contradiction in the idea, I want to know about it. I haven't come across one yet. Perhaps you'll let me know. And then the conclusion, there must be a first mover, but that conclusion is only going to be proved if, in fact, we've got a sound argument. The soundness of the argument requires that both of the premises be true, and what we're doing now is saying we're not so sure that premise number 2 is, in fact, true. Some centuries after Aquinas, another English philosopher named Samuel Clarke had a very short, very terse, but beautiful reinterpretation of Aquinas' argument that seems to be an improvement on it. To understand where Clarke is coming from, it helps to know that he distinguished between two different concepts. He gave a definition of a dependent being, whereas a dependent being is a being that has the reasons for its existence outside of itself. Very abstract notion. Just about everything that you've ever come across, probably, is a dependent being. I'm a dependent being because my existence is due to that of my parents and I guess the food I eat and the air that I breathe and so forth. The Empire State Building is a dependent being. The planet Mercury is a dependent being, and so on and so forth. As long as the thing has a reason for its existence outside of itself, it's a dependent being, firstly. By contrast, Clarke defines an independent being as you might imagine, a being that has the reason for its existence inside of itself. Now, we're not assuming that there are any independent beings yet. Just as I give you the definition of a flimp as a 17-headed reptile, and leave open the question whether or not there are any flimps on this planet, or any planet for that matter, so too I can define the concept of an independent being as something that has the reasons for its existence inside of itself, and we can still be neutral on the question for now whether or not there are any independent beings. But it's helpful for understanding Clarke to distinguish between these two concepts, and then we'll see what he's able to do with them. Okay, now he's going to try to show, intuitively that is going to be, Clarke will try to show that the universe cannot be only an infinite causal regression of dependent beings. That's a mouthful, so I'll say it again. Clarke is going to try to show that even if the universe contains an infinite causal regression of dependent beings, it couldn't contain just that. It would also have to contain at least one independent being as well. So, Clarke has no problem with the idea of an infinite causal regression, or more precisely, an infinite causal regression of dependent beings. But he wants to argue that this couldn't be all that there is. If there's that, what's called an ICRDB, infinite causal regression of dependent beings, then there must be something else as well. He's also going to use the idea of the strategy known as reductio ad absurdum, which is Latin for reduced to absurdity. Some arguments in which you try to establish a conclusion proceed by showing that some proposition P implies an absurdity. So here's a simple reductio ad absurdum argument. Suppose somebody one of your friends tells you that she and her other buddies just got together and they counted to the largest integer. You could show them that that's an absurd idea, that their claim must be wrong, because you could argue as follows. Well, suppose that the integer you just counted to is n. Well, I've got a larger integer for you, namely n plus 1. So your supposition that the integer that you counted to is the largest integer must reduce to absurdity, because you're assuming that it's the largest, but I can also show that n plus 1, by definition, must be larger than it. So that would show your friend must be mistaken in thinking that she and her buddies were able to count to the largest integer. So too, Clarke is going to try to argue that the supposition that the universe is nothing but an infinite causal regression of dependent beings, that supposition reduces to absurdity and therefore must be false. Here goes. This will be a slightly more complicated argument than the ones we've seen so far. Suppose that the universe, premise 1, suppose that the universe is nothing but an infinite causal regression of dependent beings. He's going to suppose this in the way that I supposed that n is the largest integer. Suppose it in order to reduce it to absurdity. Suppose that 1 is true. Well, this, for short, ICRDB, has to have the reasons for its existence either inside of itself or outside of itself. That is, Clark is asking, this whole series, this whole ICRDB, where did it come from? What is its source? Clark, the source is either outside the series or inside the series. Well, but wait, it can't be outside the series because we're assuming, as from premise 1, that the universe is nothing but this ICRDB. So there's nothing else besides the ICRDB inside this universe. Therefore, the cause of the ICRDB cannot be inside the ICRDB itself. It would have to be inside instead. But wait, the ICRDB is nothing but dependent beings. But no dependent being in the series can explain the entire series. Think of the series as like a stream. Something in the stream might be able to explain what is downstream from it, but couldn't explain what's upstream from it. So anything that you try to cite within the series itself could at most explain some subsequent events in the series, but not any prior events in the series. So our supposition that the universe is nothing but an ICRDB must be untrue. It reduces to absurdity. Because if the universe were nothing but an ICRDB, then it couldn't have an explanation for its existence outside of itself. It couldn't have an explanation for its existence inside of itself because the only things that are inside the series are other dependent beings, which can only explain things that are subsequent to them, nothing that are prior to them. And therefore, our supposition that the universe is nothing but a series of dependent beings must be untrue. And so the universe is either a finite causal regression of dependent beings, in which case you'd have to have a first cause, or there's at least one independent being, which has, by definition, the reasons for its existence inside of itself. Clark argues that he doesn't think that by itself proves the existence of a GCB, but he thinks he's made some headway. He thinks he's made some progress along that path. He thinks he can give us some reasons in the direction of theism by saying, even if the universe contains an infinite causal regression of dependent beings, it must also contain something else. Something very special and unusual, namely something that has the reason for its existence inside of itself. And as you can imagine, the idea of something that's got the reason for its existence inside of itself must be pretty special. And you can see why Clark would have thought that if you can establish at least one independent being, he's at least on the way towards proving the existence of a GCB.